Last week, we covered the virtue of justice. Again, realizing that this is a survey. This is not going to be comprehensive of everything about any one of these particular virtues, because whereas you can understand the virtues within, again, just by studying them, it takes a lifetime to master them. But again, examining last week the principle of justice, also again, that's what is associated with justice, we also come to the understanding that not everything is a question between black and white. Or another way of saying it, not everything is a question between right and wrong. Now, there are certain things which are right and certain things which are wrong. But those things, for the most part, are very limited. Again, you can really, for the most part, limit them to the Ten Commandments. And actually, pretty much all of the moral teachings of the church go back to, in some fashion or form, one of the Ten Commandments, when you really understand them. Again, how does the Ten Commandments apply to us today? Because obviously, the Ten Commandments are going to apply to us in a slightly different way than they're going to apply to the people 10,000 years ago. The fundamental heart's not going to change. But again, just science, technology, the ways in which we exist, again, communications, all affect and all have a moral dimension to them. But not everything has a moral dimension to it. Sometimes you're not making a choice between right and wrong. Sometimes you're making just a choice between things which are, again, sometimes between two good choices, or you can be making a choice between things which are morally neutral. That, again, something which is not necessarily going to lead you closer to God, but it's not going to lead you away from God. An example of this is where you're going to eat dinner tonight. Okay, for the most part, I don't think God really cares where you eat dinner tonight. You have that free choice yourself. Again, that you have, again, as the Garden of Eden says, you have the choice to make choices amongst a multiplicity of goods, as long as they are good things. As long as you are choosing something which is good, you know that you're not making a question of justice. Whenever you're choosing something between good and evil, it's a question of justice. If you're choosing between things which are morally neutral or things which are all good choices in front of you, is that you know you're dealing with a question of prudence, which actually I'd say, again, is one of the hardest virtues to master, because we're confronted with, again, many choices throughout the day, each and every day. It's also called the queen of virtues, the queen virtue. Human beings, and part of prudence is, again, understanding a very simple concept, which sometimes also takes a lifetime to master, and which is very easy. But it has to do with humility. Because human beings, again, our perceptions and our understanding of almost anything is often incorrect, or it can be shallow and superficial. Again, people who think that they know more, in fact, than they do. Now, again, everyone here probably knows a know-it-all. A person who thinks that they know, and they're more than happy to inform you. And actually, this was partially what I was speaking about this morning, people who are know-it-alls and tell you that this is what the church teaches. And I just want to bash my head against a table when I hear some of these things. For instance, when I hear that people were excommunicated for having divorces, I'm just like, no, that's not what the church teaches. That's a common perception. That is not what the church teaches. There are difficulties with, obviously, divorce and remarriage. But divorce, whereas it's always is a grave evil, divorce is not always a grave sin. Because a grave evil just means that something is, again, contrary to God's plan. Which a divorce is always a grave evil. But it's only a sin if you're responsible for it. And so persons who oftentimes end up in divorces will end up in a divorce, but very often, again, especially in cases of abandonment, cases of infidelities, things like this, again, both persons are not always entirely at fault. And so dealing with, again, questions of even evil, it's important to recognize that we can't judge another person's motives, and we can't judge their freedom. Well, we can judge objective acts, especially when they contradict the Word of God. If something contradicts the Word of God, then we know that we are dealing with human stupidity. Because it is, again, the authority of God provides us accuracy and depth when we're confronted with the unknown. And again, a child doesn't know many things, which is why we teach them the Ten Commandments. Again, so that they can avoid certain things which actually all of us probably have experienced when we've broken the Ten Commandments. We know that we thought it was going to make us happy, but it did not. And there's lots of times that we think that what's going to make us happy will not. But again, authority, God's authority and God's wisdom, which is also called divine revelation, we can trust because we know that God does not lie. Because unless God lies, it's kind of stupidity and error to disagree with a person who knows all things versus to agree with a person who only knows what they can perceive, what they can see. Does this make sense? Now, obviously, it's pretty simple. But again, God's knowledge obviously reflects the full reality of which man is ignorant of. God can see not only the individual picture and judge the individual person, but He's also again, cognizant and knows the entirety of the universal cosmic picture, his plan. Now, society does create particular laws and dispenses justice when there's violations of those laws. But it's also important that we don't confuse the words justice, because when we're talking about society justice, we're not talking necessarily about the virtue of justice. Because the virtue of justice is reflective of God's own identity, the unchanging element of God, the unchanging truths. Society is not the arbiter of justice, because an arbiter, if anyone understands the legal understanding of it, an arbiter, simply put, is a person who settles a dispute and has ultimate authority in a matter. Now, in terms of civil society and civil laws, yes, the state is the arbiter of civil justice. But if civil justice is not based upon virtues, then it's not going to have any connection necessarily. It can, but it's not necessarily going to have a connection to the virtue of justice. And so our allegiance as Catholics and as Christians is, first of all, to the virtue of justice, which is reflective of God, and secondarily, when this is in accordance with civil justice, then that as well. Which is why if the civil society ever tells us to do something which is in contradiction to the virtue of justice, we can tell the civil society, no. You can actually even rebel against an unjust authority, and you're not in violation of the fourth commandment, because the virtue of justice doesn't reside on the level of the authority of the society. It resides within God himself. And God imparts that authority to different persons at times. Again, and we see this in, obviously, Solomon in the Old Testament. He has the authority to make decisions. An arbiter also does not create justice. The arbiter has the authority to interpret and apply the principles of the lawgiver with finality, and they can also create particular laws which are binding. And you see this in an example perfectly with Solomon, is that his law, again, his decision as dealing, but he's also filled with wisdom, with two women. Again, some of you, if you're familiar with the story, two women come to him. They both claim a child is theirs. One of them has a dead child, and the other one has basically stolen the other one and said that this was her child. And so then Solomon, again, in wisdom, makes the determination on what's going to happen. And that determination, again, could it be wrong because he's a human being? Yes, but he's filled with wisdom. He's not. Again, which is ultimately why there's a just decision at the end of it. Matthew 16 is very clear in who the arbiter of justice on earth is. Matthew 16, which talks about the handing over the keys to Peter, specifically, and then Matthew 28 to the 12. No one else is given this authority, because specifically with the giving of keys and the understanding of what keys are, keys means that Peter doesn't have the ability to create laws of justice, but he does have the authority to interpret laws of justice. And he also has likewise the authority to create binding laws which affect a particular time and a particular place. Because also associated with the word arbiter, if you flip it into the ancient understanding, it's the word steward. A steward has authority over the household, which is why Peter will become the steward of the church. He's not the lawgiver. He doesn't create universal laws, but he does create particular laws. Does this make sense? So, prudence involves knowing and making the right decision in any particular moment. Now, the first step to being a prudent person, if you want to know prudence, prudence knows justice. And prudence will never, ever violate justice, because prudence always involves choosing the right good in the right moment. Again, if you have a multiplicity of goods or fruits to choose from, again, it involves knowing what's the good thing to choose in this particular moment out of a multiplicity of goods. But see, in order to get to prudence, you must first know justice, because if you don't know justice, you will make bad decisions. Not only will you make bad decisions, you'll make evil decisions. So, when choosing justice, justice always entails choosing the good and rejecting evil. Prudence entails knowing what the good thing to choose in the particular moment is. Which means that if you want to know among all the good choices that we have in our lives what choice to make, you also have to be able to recognize bad fruit, which is where the virtue of justice comes in. So a prudent person who is unjust is actually never a prudent person. Again, because in order to be prudent, you must first master the virtue of justice. And I can tell you, actually, at a certain point, the virtue of justice is not that difficult to master, because justice is always about the bare minimum. It's always about, what do I not do? How do I recognize evil? And as long as you can, again, avoid breaking moral laws, again, then you can actually be, for the most part, a just person. And if you want to know what the moral laws are, you go to the arbiter, which is to, again, especially if you're dealing with the virtue of justice as opposed to civil justice, you go to the church, the magisterium of the church. And also, again, this is why the fruit of justice is going to be peace, and the fruit of prudence will be joy, because you can have a society which is just but does not have joy if it's not a prudent society. Or likewise, you can be a just person but not necessarily have joy. But if you don't have peace, you'll never arrive at joy. You must first have peace before you can have joy, which is why the king virtue would be justice, but the queen virtue will be prudence. Because prudence knows justice as a queen knows the king. Violations of justice will bring death, versus violations of prudence will bring misery. So, when justice is likewise silent, you'll find very quickly that prudence will go astray. Because people will sometimes think that I'm dealing with a question of prudence, when in fact they're not dealing with a question of prudence if they don't know justice. Then they might be thinking that they're choosing a good thing, when in fact what they're choosing is an evil one. Because the decision of, again, just on the level of the Adam and Eve story, again, what Adam and Eve do in the garden is that they violate the command of God, which means that they become unjust. And that's where the whole thing. But do they always make the best decision in prudence? No, probably not in the garden. They probably make mistakes. So by making a mistake is not necessarily a sin, unless it has a moral component to it. So, justice, again, knows what not to do. It deals with the blacks and whites of life. Again, that certain things are black, certain things are white. Do not murder. Interestingly, that is not do not kill. It's do not murder. Because murder always involves the unjust taking of innocent life. That's what the commandment, the fifth commandment, absolutely prohibits. The unjust killing of an innocent life. Because there's three words in Hebrew for the word kill. And there's rachad, and I forget the other two in Hebrew. But it's basically rachad, which is the one which is absolutely prohibited, which is the unjust killing of an innocent person. Killing in war is not prohibited by the fifth commandment. Killing likewise in self-defense is not an accidental killing. There's different words in Hebrew for these things, and these things are not prohibited by the fifth commandment. What is prohibited by the fifth commandment is murder. So murder, the unjust killing of an innocent, is always black and white. Killing is not always black and white. Now, killing is always, again, not a good thing. It is always a bad thing. It is always, again, speaking, like I said, it's always a grave evil, but it's not always a grave sin. Which is why the soldier oftentimes comes back from war, and he again has this heaviness upon his heart about, again, the lives which he killed, but he's not necessarily guilty of sin, but he is guilty of, again, engaging in grave evil, but sometimes there's a necessity for that. Does this make sense? So again, participating, because also Christ also comes into a gravely evil condition, but likewise never becomes tainted by sin. Because part of it is that he's not responsible for this, but he comes in and saves. Which is, again, at times we are called to, again, fight against evil, unless fighting against evil means sacrificing a higher good. We'll get into that in a bit. So not everything, again, is a question of faith and morals. So what's some examples of this? How you do your taxes, how you do your money, how you do your finances. Again, don't come to me or to the church. I mean, you get friendly advice from me, but I'm not going to be the best person to talk to. This is completely a question of prudence. Why? Because how you handle your finances is up to you. Again, and there's probably some good ways, some different ways you handle them. Some are going to be better than others. Again, but particular situations, the time, place, location, who you're with, again, all these things can change the circumstances. Another thing, who you vote for, actually, is oftentimes a question of prudence. Again, it doesn't have, because what? You oftentimes have lots of persons to choose from. All of them have their good qualities. Some of them have the things you don't like as much. But again, for the most part, voting is usually a question of prudence. Also, what party, what political system you adopt, and what political system and economic system you try to advent and kind of purport. And this is where, again, if you want to be a capitalist, that's fine. If you want to be a socialist, that's fine. Both of them have good faults, good qualities, and both of them have some serious bad qualities. And that's, again, where people adopt one political system or one economic system and say this is the be-all and the end-all. It's not, because every system has its flaws. Capitalism, in my opinion, is a great system, but it has some serious flaws. It given to greed very easily. It's getting into stepping on the little guy, which is also why Pope Francis recently has been criticizing unbridled capitalism. He's been, again, rampant capitalism without checks and balances. Again, is he criticizing capitalism? Yes, the extreme versions of it. But is he also saying you can't be a capitalist? No, he's not. He's saying you must be prudent. You can't go to the extremes, which is actually where we'll get to next week, which is the virtue of temperance, which helps dictate behavior. But again, all these things are, again, choices. Where you go to eat tonight, or if you go to home to eat. Again, for the most part, this is morally neutral. There's no morality within this decision. And likewise, that's when people will come to me and they'll say, well, what's God's will for me? And they're like, should I go and eat at McDonald's? And I've heard things as crazy as this. So I go to McDonald's or Checkers. I'm just like, God doesn't care. Maybe he does, again, but for the most part, he leaves it up to you. You're free to choose whichever thing as long as it is a good choice. God just wants you to choose the good. Again, where you go, as long as it's in balance, again, where temperance will come in. Again, your leisure activities, what you decide to do in leisure. Again, those types of things, all, again, free choices. Free choices which will lead ultimately to the good. Again, what jobs people choose. Again, all of these things are morally neutral for the most part. Again, sometimes certain things, because of the connotation, can lead into questions of injustice. Again, by nature of what actually that is, just as the persuasive that, again, just because these are choices doesn't mean that these are totally secluded from the virtue of justice. Because obviously you can have a politician who is purporting and trying to advent evil things. And then it become that justice starts poking its head up and said, no, you have to be careful here. And likewise, the same thing with jobs. There are certain jobs which, again, we know beforehand that it's going to lead us into sin. Again, working, for instance, at an abortion clinic. But actually, even working at an abortion clinic, again, a person who's a janitor there, oftentimes trying to scrape by and get there, even though he has to work there, is he guilty of a sin because he's working there? No, not necessarily. But some people will say, well, he's contributing to it. No, he's not. He's trying to feed his family. This is the only job he can get, and he's not contributing to the killing of children. And this is not a case, again, he has to be very careful, because as soon as he starts becoming complicit in acts where he's told to help, that's when he has to say, no, this violates my conscience. But that's where, again, but taking a job as the receptionist there would be very problematic, because you're scheduling, again, things which are morally immoral. And so that's where, again, it's not that these things are totally secluded, that justice doesn't come in, but for the most part, as long as these things don't have that moral connotation, these things are all choices. And sometimes that's where, again, the church especially will come in and say, actually the church wants people to have more freedom than people sometimes assume. The church actually only will make laws when there's usually a problem. They'll only create binding particular laws when there's a problem on the small level, or likewise when there's a huge problem on the level of the church. That's when she'll make universal laws, just for, again, order, and for likewise for clarity, so people are not led astray. How you decorate your house, your living room, all of these things, questions of prudence. Again, even who you marry is a question of prudence. Because why? Because it's not just one right person or wrong and everyone else is wrong. It is that you have a multiplicity of people to choose from. So make a prudent choice, because you're going to have to be faithful to this person and live with them for the rest of your life. But it's still a question of prudence, because choosing one person over another, one person is not an evil choice and one person is not the good choice. They're both good choices. Likewise, choosing a vocation is oftentimes the same way. It's not that one is evil and one is bad. It's a question of prudence. So again, in life, as human beings, we're faced with multiple and many different choices, which is why this is what we refer to as the real end of freedom. The real end of freedom is to make choices. Now, obviously, certain choices will bring us happiness, and God knows which of the choices we make which will bring us more happiness than others. Again, where am I going to find? Well, I think that Outback, I'm going to experience more happiness. But maybe actually going home and eating dinner with my family will actually, in the long run, bring me even more happiness. So there can be, again, but is it immoral to go to Outback? No. But again, is one of them possibly going to bring me more happiness in the long run as opposed to the short term? Yes. And so again, that's why I say that the fruit of prudence, if we are imprudent constantly, it will bring to misery. So if I eat at Outback every single night, I'm going to get it as big as a house, which will be intemperate. But so again, there's the questions where, again, prudence is not just, again, willy-nilly, that there's nothing that God doesn't have which is what. But at the end of the day, even when we make imprudent decisions, it's not the end of the world. We just learn from the mistake. You don't have to go to confession, for the most part, for imprudent decisions. For violations of justice, though, you do. Violations of justice, especially when it's severe and grave, one must go to confession. And even when it's, again, violations of justice on the smaller level, that's what one has to confess in confession. Again, you have to be aware of your prudence, because especially prudence, lack of prudence, can sometimes lead to complications and disaster in the people around you. And so it can lead to a severe lack of charity for other people if you're constantly prudent. For instance, a person who gambles, gambling is, again, a question of prudence, because it's not immoral to gamble. But if you gamble all the time, you gamble away, it's not just affecting you, it'll affect the people around you as well. So likewise, it can, again, lead to self-centeredness if left unchecked. But for the most part, as long as none of the choices violate justice, you're free to choose and deal with the choices in life. Again, and we should pray to God for prudence, and we should seek and strive after it, because we know that there are certain choices that we make which, particular to us, will make us more happy, will bring us more joy, versus some which will not. And how can you tell, again, if you're dealing with it? One is there a between prudence and justice, is there a violation of one of the Ten Commandments? Again, and like we said the first week, this is a little bit more complex than just looking at, okay, I haven't killed anyone this week. Well, have you killed anyone emotionally? Have you killed anyone psychologically? Have you verbally? All the ways in which we're human beings. Again, have you brought death into the world? So likewise, looking at the Ten Commandments, does a particular action directly contradict the teaching of the church on faith and morals? If it does, you're dealing not with a question of prudence, you're dealing with a question of justice. And likewise, if the action contradicts faith and morals, again, being a question of justice, then the question becomes, well, people talk about, well, I disagree with the church, or what can you disagree with in terms of the church? Because there are certain things you can disagree with, and this is what the word is called dissent. Now, this has, again, been promulgated, and people have been talking about this for the last especially 30 years, but this is one of the most confused issues that people are confused on, because people think you can dissent on things and be a faithful Catholic, which you can't if you want to be faithful. And there's only one requirement to get into heaven, is that we're faithful. So we should know what faithfulness is and what faithfulness entails, because if you dissent from the wrong thing, you can be guilty of one, heresy, or two, if we disagree with certain things, they will play out in our lives. So what can you? Because in very unique circumstances, the Magisterium Cathedra Pastoralis, so the bishops, again, can speak without error on matters of faith and morals, and because we understand that the Holy Spirit is guiding them. And likewise, just as He guided the Holy Spirit guided and the Father guided, again, the message of truth throughout the entirety of the Old Testament, through the oral tradition and through the written tradition, the same Spirit of God is present in the church, guiding us and protecting us from error on questions of faith or moral. The use of this authority, though, is not unilateral. Not everything that the church does is going to be without errors. The main way in which you can know if something is without error, the ordinary way is, again, through the official teachings of the church, which come ordinarily through a council. So all the different councils of the church tell us what our faith is. And this is the ordinary fashion that it happens. There's also extraordinary way. One extraordinary way. When the Pope makes a statement from the chair of Peter. It's only happened 3 times in history. Because to solve a major dispute without having to call a council. But the Pope, with the authority of the keys, makes a binding declaration. But not everything that they've done, not everything that the Pope does, is going to be without error. Francis makes mistakes every day, just like we all do. And I'd say that hat is a mistake. John Paul, not everything that he said was completely without error. You can disagree with things which don't fall into the teachings of the church when individual people just do it. But what does that mean? Okay, the first level of teachings that we have in the church is what's referred to as definitive dogmas. And this is, again, revealed by divine revelation through the ordinary or extraordinary. And we understand that this is without error. To be a faithful Catholic, you cannot disagree with the dogma. If you disagree with the dogma, then you are not faithful. Like I say, you're not Catholic. You are Catholic, but you won't be faithful if you disagree with this. And this also, dogmas have an effect in the way in which we live out our daily lives. Very seriously, on our spirituality and so forth. The Trinity is a dogma of our faith. You won't actually find the word Trinity directly in Scripture, but this is a dogma of the faith. This has been promoted by the Council of Nicaea. Again, clarified by Chalcedon and by later councils, the dogma of the Trinity has a profound way in which we live out our daily lives. Now you also have below dogmas, because these are directly revealed by God, because Jesus came and revealed the Trinity to us. You can't disagree with it if you want to be faithful. Doctrines, definitive doctrines, are necessary to understand the dogmas. But the source is going to be divine because we understand that it's impelled by the Holy Spirit, but it's going to have more of a human element. And this is where you'll find that these things also we understand when they come through the ordinary or extraordinary, these are without errors. And this is where you'll find, for instance, the language of transubstantiation. So the language of real presence, the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, is a definitive dogma. It comes through us in the councils. The language of transubstantiation is what the Church has said is an apt and fitting way of understanding in a rational way what happens in transubstantiation, in the real presence. So this is a definitive doctrine of our faith. To be faithful, one cannot disagree with it, and it has a daily effect in the way in which we live out our lives. So there are dogmas and there are doctrines. Dogmas directly revealed by God versus doctrine, which will be revealed by God, but through the mediation of human beings. This comes from us the 12th century through Thomas Aquinas, applying actually even a pagan philosophy of Aristotle. But still seeing the good within that is that that's why we can say that this is, again, doctrine. But it's not dogma because you can't find it directly from the words of Christ. So then, you also then have non-definitive doctrine. Non-definitive doctrine is necessary to understand either dogmas or doctrines, but the source is going to be much more human as opposed to divine. And this is where you're going to find that these things could have error, but the application of the principles upon which they're based don't contain errors. But this is for the most part where most theologians would place medical ethics. Medical ethics falls into the category of non-definitive doctrine because science is always evolving. Science is always changing. Technology is always changing. And sometimes the church takes a while to do this, and sometimes there can even be, the church recognizes errors which are made in the application of medical ethics, because maybe we don't understand the entirety of the science. But the principles upon which we're basing the ethics, the medical ethics, again, are the doctrines and the dogmas. So for instance, the church is teaching on the fundamental reality of marriage being about two ends, the procreative and the unitive. That is dogma. That's on the level of sacraments. Now that's also where the church is teaching on various forms of reproductive services, also falls into, this separates those two ends. And if it separates those two ends, then this is not a violation, again, where someone can say that this is disagreements. That's why it falls, for instance, on abortion or artificial contraception or on a lot of different things that people think these are just medical, they can contain errors. They could, if our understanding of the science is wrong, but it has to be shown why. Because as these things exist now, but we also realize that although they could contain errors, they're not going to really contain errors very often. These things are, for the most part, very certain because they're based upon very concrete, clear principles. And so the fourth level is what we refer to as providential guidance. Providential guidance is the applications of dogmas and doctrines in specific circumstances. And so this is where we're going to find, again, oftentimes the rulings of the diocese, how the bishop decides particular laws for his diocese. Again, how you apply certain things in different ways, liturgical laws. Again, now could these things have errors? Yes. Are they more likely to actually have errors? Yes. But see, and sometimes people think that, okay, well, if they could have error and I can disagree with it, I can act differently. To be a faithful Catholic, and the definition of faithfulness is that you can disagree and dissent on this level. You can disagree on this level if you can show it on some type of medical reason for why you disagree, and it's not violating the principle. You can't disagree on this level. You can't disagree on this level. But on all four levels, to be a faithful Catholic, you are called to obedience. So people who are disobedient, who choose not to act in correlation with the teachings of the church, find themselves unfaithful. Does this make sense? So because why? Because Mother Church. God is our Father. We are called to be obedient like children. Do parents make mistakes at times? Yes. But are children called to be obedient to the well-rulings of the house, even if the parent makes a prudential mistake on this level and this level? Yes, they are called. If they disagree and they violate their parents' authority, they're guilty of breaking the fourth commandment. Likewise, people who act contrary to this, because again, you can dissent but still be obedient on this level. And you can also dissent and be disobedient. If you're dissent and are disobedient on these two bottom level, you find yourself unfaithful. Does this make sense? Yes?
Did you say, where did you put contraception?
Contraception, the principle by which the church understands why artificial contraception is immoral, the principle is on the level of dogma, which is the violation of the procreative and the unitive end. But in the actual application of the dogma on the level of medical ethics, which falls into the reproductive services, it falls into the non-definitive doctrines. Well, that's what most theologians would say. It's not actually, we know that the principles are dogmas, but the application in terms of it could, again, because science is changing, because you can have, again, that's where medical ethics is, we'll get into questions of, does this actually separate the procreative and unitive end? Without getting into too much detail, there's like questions of the big one right now, which has not been determined as far as I know, was what about nuns who are in countries where they have a likelihood of being raped? Okay, and therefore if they're raped, well, can they use the artificial contraceptives to prevent birth? Because in this case, there's not a separation between the unitive and the procreative end, because they're not in a unity with the person who's raping them, and therefore, so there's very fine tooth sometimes questions on that. Is does this actually separate the procreative and the unitive end? Again, I can get into that later. Huh? No. But in the context of marriage, you're not dealing with that. In the context of marriage, you're not dealing with things like that. And even that question right there, as far as I know, has not been answered by the Vatican. That's one of the questions which is being proposed to the ethicists of the Vatican right now. Does this actually separate the procreative and the unitive if there's not a unity already present in the context of marriage? It's also where Pope Benedict a couple of years ago, he was asked about people who are using prophylactics to try to prevent the spread of STDs when they're using them with prostitutes. And Pope Benedict's response was, and people took it out of context, Pope Benedict's response was, well, at least they're slightly aware that they don't want to spread the disease, and so at least there's a certain element of charity there. But therefore everyone was saying Pope Benedict allowing this to happen, is legalizing it, and it's just like, no, he was trying to point out, he's like, at least they're aware that something's wrong here and they're trying to limit the spread of it, but he's not, at the same time, he wasn't saying this was okay, if that makes sense. But that's where, again, you'll find people take the words of the popes out of context all the time, and especially Francis recently. And again, fifth level is what I refer to as friendly advice. You can take this with a grain of salt. You don't have to be obedient whatsoever to the advice or the dictations of the priests, because not everything. No. Now, the world will make the claim that many choices are questions of prudence, personal preference, when in fact it is promoting relativism, which if you can actually define relativism in a certain sense, which is prudence devoid of justice, that everything is just a choice between what's good for you, particular goods. And so likewise, relativism is actually a major problem, because what relativism does is it not only destroys justice, which is the universal norms, the universal laws, the universal plan, but also will destroy prudence itself. Because again, you can't be a relativist and also be prudence. Prudence, which deals with, again, if justice pursues the universal common good, prudence is pursuing the individual good. Which is also why you need knowledge, understanding, and wisdom to know what that particular good is for you, as long as you're dealing with things which are good. This is why I say it deals with the gray areas of life, because what might be good for you in some sense might not be the exact same thing that's going to be good for another person if you're dealing with, again, what's the best decision. There's not just one way to handle finances. There's multiple ways. Again, and so again, there's multiple values and lots of different things like this. Again, ignorance and likewise limited understanding oftentimes affect our ability to be prudent, because again, we do deal with the fact we don't know everything, which is why also forgiveness is going to be a necessary component, because you'll make mistakes. And when you make mistakes of prudence, it doesn't always have a moral connotation, therefore it's not always sinful. Which is also why when people refuse to forgive for mistakes, is that you have a huge problem, because people will make mistakes all the time. Again, prudence without justice will lead to relativism. Prudence without fortitude will lead to cowardice. And prudence without temperance will lead to extremism. Because again, all these virtues go hand in hand. You cannot have one without the others. This is what St. Josemaria Escobar says. There are many pretty terms that I don't like. You call cowardice prudence. Your prudence gives an opportunity to the enemies of God without any ideas in their head to pass themselves off as scholars, and so reach positions that they should have never attained. Again, because people who don't believe that there are general norms, again, will lead to a certain cowardice in society because it will destroy prudence. Wisdom, which is actually the highest fruit, is one of the highest goods, is again, being able to understand the right application of knowledge. Having knowledge for the sake of knowledge is pointless unless it brings it into action, unless it changes things. So again, people who just acquire knowledge but they don't ever put anything into action, it's pointless, it's fruitless. Prudence and wisdom deal with, again, the right application of understanding knowledge, and prudence entails acting rightly. Again, all of the cardinal virtues are all about action. Again, justice is acting in a just way. Prudence is acting in a prudent way. And because sometimes it's prudent to die, such as Daniel in the lion's den, is that he's described as being the wisest and likewise the most prudent of all men. And there's a certain point where he's told then to violate a question of justice. And again, there's no one who has a better legal mind than Daniel. And even in our saints, we have a person named by the name of Thomas More. Thomas More was a very prudent man. His individual good he chose. Now, certain people during the time of the Anglican Revolution, or the what's it called? What are you know? I'm talking Reformation. Thank you. When the English Church separated, there were certain people who stood up for their faith and they said, "I want to die. I'm willing to die," and they died. And then there were certain people who, for them, they decided that they didn't want to die. Thomas More was an example of this. He didn't want to die. And he did everything he could to live without violating his faith. And so he just remained silent. And this really upset King Henry VIII. But he didn't have anything on him, so he just remained silent. Earlier in the church, you also have a case of, again, Ignatius of Antioch, who tells his community, first century church father, he says, "Don't come and save me, don't do it. I want my flesh to be gnawed upon by the lion so I can be Eucharist for you. That's what I want my martyrdom to be." And then you have, guess what? You also have Polycarp, who flees and runs away from the Romans and is hiding and hides out for like 50 years before they finally catch him. So what, is there one way? No, because for Ignatius, this was what he decided to choose, was martyrdom, and to pursue it. Versus Polycarp, who at the end of the day did everything he could to avoid it, just like Thomas More avoided and tried to do everything he could to be made a martyr. But at the end of the day, when they were told to when Polycarp was told to offer sacrifices to the gods, when Daniel was told to offer sacrifices to the gods, both of them said, no, this will violate justice. And in prudence, they decided it's more prudent to die and to remain just than to become unjust. So, a prudent person likewise does not sin, or at least tries to avoid sin. They know justice, they don't violate it ever. But again, just being just does not mean you're automatically going to be prudent, because violations of prudence will lead to misery, which is why I say the opposite of prudence is stupidity. Persistent stupidity, especially. Or ignorance. Again, this is Mark Twain. Never argue with stupid people. They'll drag you down to their level and beat you with experience. Chesterton, no man who worships education has got the best out of education. Without a gentle contempt for education, no man's education is complete. Again, if you understand what he's getting at. Again, I love Einstein on this, a good Jew. Two things are infinite, universe and human stupidity. I'm not so sure about the universe. John Wayne, life is hard. It's even harder when you're stupid. Again, possibly misquoted to Einstein, but I fear the day that technology surpasses human interaction, the world will have a generation of idiots. Getting maybe a little bit closer to home. With fame, I become more and more stupid, which of course is a very natural phenomenon. The difference between stupidity and genius is that genius has its limits. What Einstein is actually getting at is a fundamental truth, as well that Socrates did. I know that I'm intelligent because I know that I know nothing. But what is being really gotten at is that they're humble. Actually, at the end of the day, what seems like arrogance is actually humility. They seem like they are claiming to have a lot of more knowledge than other people, and they do because they recognize what they don't know. They recognize, there's a grand scope. That's also what Thomas Aquinas said at the end of his life. He says, I'm stopping writing because God has shown me far more than I can't even convey it. everything that I've written is straw. Everything is piffle. He said, there's so much more that I become aware of, and I know that there's so much more. See, when we think that we know more than we do, we will never become prudent. Because a prudent person is always cognizant of the fact is that there's so much more that we don't know. Again, is always cognizant of also the fact that if there is a God, and God is omniscient, that you know what? God is the one to trust, not me and myself. Me, myself, and my limited views. And so the truly prudent person, in order to know, again, the first step to wisdom, which is the fruit of prudence, is always knowing that at the end of the day, most of our knowledge, unless it comes directly from God, is for the most part bound by perception. And therefore, once you know that there's so much that we don't know, then you can start building authentic knowledge. Then you can start building authentic wisdom. Does this make sense? Which is also why a call to humility is key and pivotal if we want to be wise and prudent and just people. Because the humble person recognizes, you know what, at the end of the day, I know how to be just. I just avoid breaking the Ten Commandments. Again, but if I want to be prudent, I have to have, in a very real sense, a love affair with God, who is the source of all wisdom, who will constantly show me more and more and more. He'll show me what the decisions are in my life that I really need to make and apply the knowledge which I have. It's also Jesus on the cross. Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they do. Again, he doesn't even he doesn't even say that they're harsh, because he knows that at the end of the day, they're stupid. Father, they don't know what they do. Because I guarantee, I can tell you this, to crucify the Son of God is pretty stupid. If you really understand that in a very real sense. Why? Because this is actually what, I'm trying to remember who it was. It was one of the church fathers. He was Augustine, I read the other day in the Office of Readings. It said, when you kill the Son of God, you must answer for his blood. And if you have not accepted his blood upon you, you're still going to have to answer to God for why his Son's blood is on you, is on your hands. Because by sin, all of us have crucified Christ. But when we accept his redemption, we also recognize that for the most part, even the persons of his time, were they evil people? No, they had their good reasons for why they did what they did, but it was wrong. But even Jesus recognizes and calls and reminds his Father of their ignorance, as opposed to their knowledge. Because in our ignorance, we can receive mercy if we are humble. Lord, I didn't know better. It's also, again, King David, the greatest pain that he has is all of a sudden he has the knowledge, the understanding that all of his sins that he didn't think were that bad are coming back to haunt him. And he sees it in not just lived out in his life, he starts seeing it lived out in the lives of his children. So again, prudence always depicted with the mirror, again, holds humility close to her breast because she's keenly aware of what she doesn't know, which is why constant self-reflection, constant examination of self, looking at one's motives, looking at one's heart, and actually asking God, Lord, show me what's really going on here. That's why, again, the foundation of actually Ignatian spirituality is, again, examination, self-examination, because only in constant self-examination do we become wise. Because then we start to realize, you know what, there's so much even about myself I don't know. I don't understand even completely my motives for why I did this. St. Paul, I don't do the things I want to do, and I do the things I don't want to do. And there's that mystery. It's a frustrating mystery to it, but there's still, again, encounters with knowing what one does not know, which is also why you don't just leave yourself in ignorance. You don't just leave yourself where you just remain stupid, and you just keep doing the same thing over and over and over again, expecting a different result, which is the definition of sanity. Is that what? You desire to act appropriately, and so you acquire the knowledge, which is why prudence always seeks and strives after wisdom and knowledge. Always studying, always examining, always trying to grow in knowledge. Because the more you grow in knowledge and then apply it, you don't grow in pride, you grow in humility. Does this make sense? Which is why people who stop studying their faith become stagnant. People who stop studying and likewise growing in a relationship with God through prayer become stagnant. But as soon as you become stagnant, you lose prudence. Because it's not prudent to be stagnant. It's always prudent to investigate, to grow, even to ask hard questions, especially when one doesn't understand. It doesn't seem rational, it doesn't seem reasonable, it doesn't seem realistic. again, what the church asks or what we understand that God asks of us. But at the end of the day, we know that God knows more than we do. And maybe there's just the possibility that there's a piece of the puzzle that we just quite can't grasp. But if we spend a lot of time in reflection, if we spend a lot of time looking into the motivations of our heart, if we spend a lot of time examining why does the church, not just what the church, if you know what, that's justice. If you know why, that's prudence. This is why we can't just seek to be just people. We have to seek prudence at the same time, because very quickly, in the absence of prudence, very quickly justice will go out the window. Because if you remain imprudent for a long time, you're going to start confusing lapses of prudence with lapses of justice, which likewise will bring chaos and death. Not always in a physical sense. Sometimes it'll be an emotional, sometimes it's psychological, sometimes it's spiritual, sometimes a relational. Which is why, again, prudence is actually one of the virtues which we should be constantly striving for. And again, always keeping in the back of mind, am I just? Have I violated justice? Am I being a just person? Justice tells us what not to do for the most part. Prudence tells us what to do. The good things, all the choices that we make. When prudence is confronted with a choice between two evil choices, though, many people think you do this. You choose the lesser of two evils. This is a misapplication of the principle. You do not choose ever an evil. Prudence never chooses to do. Prudence chooses neither. Prudence does actually occasionally permit an evil to occur, but prudence will never be complicit in causing an evil to occur. And there's a very big distinction here, because one of them is, again, prudence being filled with wisdom knows when to act and when not to act. And there are certain times when, if you act, you sacrifice a higher good. And prudence never does this. And we actually see this in God himself. Prudence does fight against evil, but prudence will never fight evil with evil, because we see this in the example of Mary. Again, also why Mary's actions last versus the other female savior figures in the Old Testament, Judith, Jael. Again, when they fight violence with violence, it brings peace for a very short period of time, but it does not last. Because evil cannot fight evil with evil. You have to only fight it with truth, with goodness, and with beauty, and likewise evil will have to flee. Which is why when you're choosing the lesser of two evils, that's the whole point. The whole key point of that, why that's wrong, is the choosing. You don't choose to do an evil. Mary doesn't do it. We see Jesus never does it. And actually God, throughout the entirety of Scripture, never acts in an evil fashion. But what he does occasionally do is he has to occasionally permit evil to occur. And there's actually a parable associated with this in the New Testament from Christ. Is that it says the parable of the seed and the sower and the enemy who comes in the middle of the night. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it's again that a landowner goes out and scatters good seed. And in the middle of the night, an enemy comes in and scatters bad seed. And then as it all of a sudden grows up the next day, the tenants, the angels, come to the landowner and they say, should we tear out the bad weeds? And then God says, it says the landowner, which is God, says, no, don't tear the bad weeds out. Again, it's called the wheat and the tares. Don't tear the bad weeds out, because you might tear some of my good plants out with it. He said, let them grow together, and then when it comes time for judgment, then we will be very clearly able to see the difference between the wheat and the tares, between the weeds and the wheat. And therefore, likewise, we have to permit them to grow together, because I will not lose one of my pieces of wheat. Everything which can be saved will be saved, but that means that what? He has to permit the evil to occur. Because sometimes, again, we have to permit evil to occur, but to permit an evil to occur does not mean that we are acting to bring it about. And this is a hard thing to master. I'll tell you this, it's very hard to master this particular one. But we can, because otherwise you fall into this. To act in evil manner as long as the evil is not as bad as the alternative. That's again the choosing the lesser of two evils. Versus permitting an evil to occur to avoid an inevitable greater evil from occurring. One of them is called utilitarianism versus the other one, which is Catholic teaching. Again, this is also a doctrine. So you cannot what? You cannot bring about, you cannot be the cause, you cannot be the one who acts in an evil fashion, even to do a good thing. If you act in an evil fashion, you have violated justice and lost prudence. But at times, again, to act, and I'll give you an example. Be very imprudent for me, but sometimes, just in the way people sometimes, again, talk with me, about the information that I already have. Or they sometimes will be asking me a question that if I were to give information or I were to even talk about a subject, I would violate the sacramental seal because I know certain things. Again, or people have talked to me confidentially as a priest. And again, sometimes people seeking information, so it doesn't happen very often, but every once in a while, people seeking information will try to get information. And if you don't act, or if you act, or if you say no, well, obviously lying is not an option. Again, but if you say nothing, then they get their information that they want. I don't know if you've ever been in a situation where that's happened. If you say nothing, it's damned if you do, damned if you don't. And so likewise, what you sometimes have to do is do nothing. Nothing at all. Is that sometimes when people are talking, I just have to remain silent. And again, sometimes it's actually very, 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 very hard, because sometimes I would really like to act on some of the information because I know certain things. For instance, if I hear abuse, again, I don't like hearing this, but it's likewise, it's important that I hear it because likewise I can bring forgiveness and things like that. But likewise, if I hear abuse, if I violate the sacramental seal, then what happens is that if I violate the sacramental seal, even in the cases of abuse, and this is a question of, in the States right now, what happens with priests who have found out about abuse within the sacrament, is that are we required, because by law, they're trying to make it that by law we have to violate the seal and let the state know so that they can punish accordingly. But actually, if we violate the sacramental seal, then we will sacrifice the higher good of the people's trust in the sacraments. And so I have to permit, and it's not always fun. It's actually heartbreaking. I sometimes have to permit things to occur that I would love to call the police about, but I can't. Because if I do that, no one will trust the sacrament. No one will come to the sacrament. No one will also experience the healing of the sacrament. And so if I act imprudently, even for a particular good, and I violate the higher good of the universal trust of the people in the sacraments, then likewise I have acted in an imprudent and unjust manner. Does this make sense? So again, does that break my heart sometimes? Yes. But am I willing to have my heart broken for this? Yes. Because at the end of the day, if we permit evil to occur, even God does this. But we can never act to bring about an evil, even for the best of intentions. Does this make sense? So, that's actually all I got for today. Does anyone have any questions?